Okay, good afternoon, good morning. Um, my name's Peter Badley. Just want to check that people can hear the audio okay. So I'd appreciate if just one or two people could just post to the chat just to say that they could hear me okay. Okay, I'm gonna assume that there's lots of messages coming through. Fantastic. That's looking great. I've also had a couple of questions about whether we're doing recordings or not. Yes, we are recording this webinar as well, so we'll send you out the link to the recording shortly after the webinar's finished today. Okay, so let's get started. Just a brief introduction to myself. So my name's Peter Badley. I'm the product manager here at Provision Point. So my role really is about helping people maximize the benefits from Microsoft 365, and specifically the role Provision Point provides in that in terms of helping them provision sites, teams, groups, and also manage their governance and lifecycle requirements more effectively. Now, just to briefly introduce Provision Point to you, it's a provisioning and change management solution for Office 365. We're very much about empowering user self-service, so we want to let users be able to create sites, groups, and teams, but we want to ensure that organizations don't compromise their important governance and compliance rules by empowering self-service. So we allow organizations to put approval processes, their own classification, and apply privacy and security as part of users being able to request various objects within Microsoft 365. And then we also add lifecycle components on top of that. So being able to manage ongoing change, see a timeline of activity, and also expire various objects. And we'll have a look at some of the various features of Provision Point in a demo within this presentation today. So just a brief agenda of what we're going to go through. We're going to initially just do an introduction, just sort of setting up what the problem is. So explaining some of the challenges around using Teams and some of the feedback we get from organizations when we talk around what they're doing around Teams. Next, we'll go into a demo. So we'll do a demo of Provision Point, primarily focused around Teams today. And then finally, we'll revisit some of the topics which we talk at the beginning here and look at how we plan for success with Teams. Okay, so I'm sure everyone's relatively familiar with Teams, so I'm not going to talk a lot about the features of Teams today or do a demo of Teams today. What I want to talk about is some of the challenges or some of the problems which organizations have using Teams. And I've identified 4 key ones, which is based on the organizations which we're talking with and working with and thinking about how they're using Teams actively or how they're planning for Teams. So I'm going to talk about Teams creation. I'm going to talk about privacy and classification, the actual structure of the team, so settings and channels, and then expiring and archiving Teams once they're finished with. And so to start with, I'm just going to focus on some of the challenges and problems in these 4 different spaces. So firstly, team creation. So out of the box in Office 365, you sign up to Office 365, you've maybe started using it for email or just for chat within Teams. Everyone can create a team, so all of your users can create a team, which means they can create Office 365 group and a SharePoint site associated with it, as well as being able to create that team, start storing files, start to manage all these different apps. There's no justification or approval process associated with that. Everyone can just create them. Now, in one sense, that's great. You know, everyone's empowered to start collaborating. But what you actually end up with is lots of teams being created with no guidance to users around when they should be creating teams, no check processes with the relevant person who's responsible for that area. You end up with a long list of teams and users increasingly find it unmanageable to work with. And the other problem with everyone being able to create teams is the fact that there's no controls over how they're named natively within Microsoft 365, unless you leverage some of the capabilities associated with things like Azure P1 subscriptions. So you can't enforce standardization around how teams are named. Someone can just call their team finance, even if they don't actually work in finance. If you're creating projects, you can't link those to a project code or a division which that project is for. Whatever your requirements around consistency of and making the names which appear in teams relevant, there's no way to do that easily without either a lot of user education or more expensive licensing. The second challenge area to think about, and which we see organizations struggling with, is that whole area around privacy and security and classification. When I come to the Teams client, I can create a team. I can decide whether it's private or public, no matter what I'm creating it for, and no matter what sensitivity level it's got. So I could create a confidential team, which is public, or a top secret team, which is public, because I can just do that. There's no controls around how I set things like classifications, or whether I can set a certain type of team for a certain type of use as private and public. And the same applies to guest access. Guest access is either on for all of your teams or off for all of your teams at the tenant level. Once they're on, I could go and create a top secret team and start inviting external people into that. And there's no easy way of managing that. Now, an administrator can run PowerShell scripts to lock down those specific teams. That's an extra administration step which they have to remember to do or be requested to do by the user making that request. So it's very difficult for an organization to ensure that teams are correctly secured and teams are correctly classified, and to be confident that people are using them for the right purposes. Next big area of challenge around teams is the fact that out of the box they're all created the same. So when you create a team, you get one channel called General with the ability to source some files, and there's a wiki tab in there and some chat, but that's it. If I'm creating a team for a project, I have to actually start to think about what I want to include within that team. So do I want to add additional channels? Do I want to add additional apps? Do I want some default files and folders included within that team? All of the settings are turned on by default, so members of the team can start creating channels, deleting channels, changing it however they wish. And that's fine. In some scenarios, actually, a user wants to build up something themselves. But actually, in a large organization, when you want people to go through and request teams for specific purposes, actually, to make it relevant for me as a user, I want stuff straight away. So I want to be able to create a team for my project, and it's got some channels defined about how I manage that project. It's got a load of useful resources. And maybe it's got all the apps I need for my project pre-configured. I don't want to have to think about configuring all of that because I might do it wrong. And actually, I might well want to create teams for different purposes. So why do they always all start off blank? From a user adoption point of view, actually, it's much easier if I can have something which is immediately relevant to me. And then the final challenge area is basically sprawl. All of those three previous points mean that users can create lots of teams and they're unmanaged. It's heavily reliant on a user to archive off the teams which they own. And if they don't, then a user's interface can be very easily cluttered up with lots and lots of teams. And they're not sure which ones are active, which ones they should be using for that specific project or collaboration they're working on, because someone could have created 3 or 4 different teams and they're not sure which one to use, and that you're heavily reliant on that user to archive it. So actually, organizations quickly find, and we're finding that users get really frustrated with this and they actually stop using teams because they just find it completely unmanageable. So one of the big challenges is thinking about how do we start to automatically archive off some of those teams which have been created. So that's where Provision Point comes in. That's where we can start to apply some various governance rules as part of the provisioning process and allow users to create teams which are immediately relevant to them and ensure that those teams are effectively archived once they've been created. So my demo today, I'm going to take two brief scenarios to show you the capability of Provision Point and answer some of those key challenges which I've been talking about at the beginning of this webinar. So the first one is we're going to create a confidential team. This is about showing that using Provision Point, you can ensure a team is more locked down with certain privacy and security settings applied, and you're creating something which is relevant for that purpose. The other scenario is perhaps one of the most famous Office 365 scenarios. So creating something for a project, in this case, a team. So having some apps and channels which are immediately relevant, allowing the person making the request to have more flexibility over the privacy and guest access settings, but then putting an authorization step in place to archive that team appropriately and have an approval as part of it being created. So let's dive into our demo. Here I am logged into Office 365. So I'm logged in as myself, Peter Badley. There you go. And I'm going to switch over to the Provision Point app. I can access this just directly within my app launcher here. So it's just an app which I trust into my Office 365 tenant. And I can do a few different things in here. I can firstly look at the directory and see the different teams and sites which have been created using the Provision Point app. And next I can go to the request screen. And the request screen is where me as a user can go and request certain types of objects, and they will be created based on the rules defined within my organization. So I've got a couple of services which I can request here, which I've configured for this demo. So the first one is this confidential team. So say I want to create a team for a new finance process which we're developing. So I'm coming into Provision Point and I'm starting to fill out this request form. In here, I've got a section where the privacy settings around that team are defined. So I can see that it's confidential, it's private, and guest access is disabled. And in these scenarios, I can't change any of these. So unlike creating a team just through the team's experience, I'm being restricted around what I can do. Next, we're able to ask the user to classify that team further with additional business metadata. So, for example, selecting a division or business unit and specifying a business owner for that team, maybe someone who takes ultimate responsibility for it. I can then choose to add additional members and owners to that team if I want to. So we'll add an additional owner. And I'm then going to hit request. And based on the settings defined by my administrators within Provision Point, this will either immediately start to request this team in this scenario, or it could go through an approval process, which we'll show you in the next demonstration. Now, I'm actually, as this user, an administrator of Provision Point, so I can actually go and show you some of the administration settings behind the scenes. So I'm going to go to the admin tab, and this is where admin users can define various what we call service definitions. And a service definition is the settings behind a specific object. And in Provision Point, we support creating a number of different types of objects. So we can create SharePoint sites, both classic and modern, Office 365 groups, and Microsoft Teams. And then within my service definition, I can define a number of settings. So I can, dependent on the object being created. So if I go to team settings, for example, this is where I define all of the settings against the team created from this service definition. Now, remember, when a team is normally created, all of these settings we see here are turned on by default. By using Provision Point, we can restrict those settings based on specific organizational requirements. The same applies for channels. So thinking about that problem, which I highlighted earlier, around settings and channels, here I can define the different channels included within my team. So I've got 3 here, and even go and define the different tabs and apps. So making it immediately relevant to the user. The next problem which you might remember is about that everyone can request teams. Now, we can certainly say, and using provision point, allow everyone to request a certain service definition, but we can also lock that down to specific users. So you can see here that this is only locked down to this security group called PP admins. Now let's also think about privacy and classification. So again, you can apply these sensitivity classifications to SharePoint sites and Microsoft Teams, but by default, a user can pick from any of the available classifications. So I've got 5 configured within my environment, but in this scenario, I've locked it down to only being available, only the confidential option being available. And finally, those security settings which I set. So my team is private and guest access is disabled, and the user isn't able to change these settings when requesting this service. Now, while I've been just showing you a little bit around those settings which I've applied, my team has created. So let's go and have a look at it. And inside a provision point, we can see various bits of information. So I can see the name of the team, the privacy settings, that extra business metadata. And I can go and have a look at the team. Now I'm going to open it up in the web browser just because it's a little bit quicker to show you today than wait for my Teams client to log in. And I'm just going to show you a few of the settings which I applied around this team. So here's my new team. It's called Finance Process. And you can immediately see that it's different from a standard team which gets created. It's customized to my business requirements to address some of those key challenges. So I've got multiple channels, one for reports, one for meeting. And within each of those channels, I'm also defining any tabs and apps I want to include. So for example, in the general tab, I've added that YouTube video. And this just links off to one of our provision point videos, but that could link off to various training resources, perhaps in a scenario you'd be looking at. I can also configure default folders within the different channels. So providing people an immediate structure to file files in channels based on the specific requirements. So you can see them there. And then if I switch to a different channel, to the meetings channel, I can have different folders configured there. We're not just limited to controlling the channels. You'll see when I set up the service definition that I was also defining certain default settings depending on how I wanted that team configured. What else have I done? Well, I've set the team automatically to be private and it's confidential. And guest access is disabled. So ensuring those privacy and classifications are set dependent on my business requirements. So for example, if I go and try and add my Outlook.com address, it won't let me because that's an external address to my tenant and it's locked down on this team, even though guest access is enabled at my tenant. So that first demo will have just demonstrated how we can control some of those key things which are important to an organization, those key privacy and classification settings, but also providing something to the user which is immediately relevant. Let me show you one other example. So I've switched to a different user, Andrew in this case. When he goes and requests a service within Provision Point, he's restricted to one option. So sure, we want to empower all users to create new teams within my organization, but actually it might not be appropriate for certain users to create certain types of teams with certain classifications or certain structures in place. So he's only able to create a project team. So I'm going to come in here and maybe he's creating a new project for his CRM system he's implementing. So I'm going to give it a name and description. Now in this scenario, the privacy settings are slightly different. I can see my classification is internal and I can change it, but I'm limited to the options which I can select. So ensuring those important governance rules are applied and that I can't, in this case, create a top secret team for a project. So I'm going to change that classification to standard. I could change the privacy settings because I've been allowed to. And I can enable guest access. So I'm going to turn that on. And you'll see at the bottom here, I'm also applying what we call a lease, so an expiry object to archive that team. Let's add my key business metadata and add a sponsor for my project. And then hit request. Now in this scenario, it's not creating the team straight away. So instead of, oh, I could just go off and create the team, maybe we want to put a check in place. So we can see it's pending approval. If I switch back to the other user here, Peter, he'll have received an email telling him that there's been an approval task assigned to him for the CRM project. And he also receives a task within the Provision Point app. So you can define whether those approval processes go to specific users or groups of users for approval. So I'm going to come in here and I can look at the details of the request. I can see that Andrew's made it. I can see that various privacy and security settings he's applying. And at the bottom here, I can choose to approve or reject it. And in this case, I'm clicking approve and the process will continue. Now, I've only got one approval step here, but I could have multiple approval steps if I wanted to have a more complex authorization process. Now, while that team is creating in the background, I just want to show you a couple of extra administration features around Provision Point. Firstly, as an administrator, I can go in and monitor requests in the job queue. If I get any issues around those, I can diagnose those problems myself and replay those requests. Now let's go and have a look at how this service definition is configured for the project team and why it differs and applies and addresses some of those other challenges which we highlighted. So we can see different team settings are turned on. So instead of a one-size-fits-all team, we've got teams configured in different ways. So this one has more of those settings enabled because we want to make it more collaborative. Next, I've got different channels configured. So for example, the testing channel has a stream video. Under classification, I'm allowing people making the request to change that classification, but I'm restricting which classifications the user can select from. So I don't want them selecting some of my more sensitive classification levels when they're requesting this team, because that's the business rules I want to put in place. The same applies for security. So here the team defaults to private, but the requester can change it, and guest access is disabled, but the requester can choose to change that as well. So giving people a bit more control for certain types of teams which can be requested using Provision Point. Finally, I want to talk about the lease component. So the lease component is where we can apply an archiving rule. So managing that sprawl and implementing appropriate archiving processes when my teams reach a certain point. So I can set a lease length. So in this case, I'm saying that the team is archived after the lease expires after 10 days. And then I can say what actions occur. So I can say that after 10 days, I want my team automatically archived so that it's appropriately managed out of the system. Now, an owner of that team can then choose to extend that lease, because within Provision Point, we make various actions enabled for an owner to then do on that team. So in this case, I could change the archive state or even change the lease length. Now let's just go and have a look at a little bit of that. So there's my new team, CRM project. And if I click into here, I can see the details of that. So privacy and classification settings again. I can see my lease object, which will, this graphic will change as the lease moves forward. Let's go and have a quick look at my team. Let's just do it as Andrew so we can see it as his user. So I can go and see that I've been added to this new project. Here's my project. In this case, I've got a general meetings and testings channel. This one includes a planner tab. I've got a meetings tab again. I've also got a testing tab, which includes my stream video. So different content relevant to what I'm creating. Under the files tab, I've got a different set of folders. I've also included a default file. So actually, when I'm creating a team for a specific purpose, I've actually got content immediately relevant for me to use. I've applied different privacy settings are applied, so different rules dependent on which teams get created. So private, but with a different classification available. And in this case, I can add people outside my organization. So I could add a guest user to my team. In this scenario, I've got more settings enabled for my team as well. Finally, just to wrap up the demo and talk a little bit briefly about this lease concept. So within 10 days, this would automatically archive, unless as an owner of that team, I came in and extended the lease for a longer period of time. Or at any point, I can choose to archive that team via the actions. And that team will be archived within Provision Point, and it will also be set with an archived state within Microsoft Teams. I can see that in two ways. So briefly returning to my team. And we'll see that that team is now archived. So we can see it's archived. It won't be in my main list of teams there. So decluttering teams. And also within Provision Point, we see an archive, a history of activities which have occurred. So the initial creation process, including details of the approval, and the archiving action which has occurred. So there's our brief demo of Provision Point. Let's now see how you can use some of the things which we talked about and plan for getting better success out of teams. So I just want to revisit these key points around teams creation, privacy and classification, settings and channels, and exploration and archiving. So we've talked about the problems, but how do you plan for these areas and make your team's implementation more successful? Well, firstly, team creation. You need to think about who is able to create teams. Can everyone create teams, or are different types of teams defined to be created by different groups of users? Do you need to put approval processes in place? We've got a right mixture at Provision Point. Some of our customers want approval steps when teams are created. They feel that it's not very intrusive to the users. It's just a simple check, a confirmation. Others limit that down to just certain types of teams which are created. And do you want to implement any naming conventions around teams? So using Provision Point, we can apply certain naming conventions to the team to prefix it or suffix it with a certain reference which a user fills in when they request that team. So taking the example of the project which I showed you, I did set my project code as a prefix to the team name. Now, privacy and classification, I think, is one of the most important areas around Teams and Office 365 generally. If users are able just to create everything themselves, then it runs a lot of risks, and there could be data shared incorrectly. And this is what generally encourages users, organizations, to lock things down and start to put a lot of barriers in place for adoption, and want users to have to send requests to help desks, and they just get frustrated and use other applications. Now, actually what you want to think about is, what rules do you want to put in place, and then think about the best way of achieving those. So should all teams be public or private, or do you have different types of templates which set those accordingly? The same applies to classifications. Are you going to use them, and how are they going to be defined against different types of teams which get created? And additional business metadata. So I showed you just a few of the different types of field business data which we capture within Provision Point. We will capture a much wider set of information as well. And then think about the role of guest access. Guest access within Teams is fantastic, but do you really want it enabled for every single team which gets created? Or are some teams actually need to contain that sort of sensitive information which you want to be confident isn't shared with guest external users? And how do you make Teams more relevant to your users? Yeah, you can implement lots of training to show them how to create and configure different teams. But actually, for many people, they just want to click a button and it creates something which is useful for them straight away. So actually, think about what a certain type of team means to you. If I'm creating a team for a project, what is included in that? What channels, what apps, what files and folders are included within that team? What different settings? How do we want to let people collaborate in that scenario? Do we want to let it more open, where people can create new channels and message freely? Or actually, are we looking for certain more locked down teams with those privacy and classification settings, but also a much more strict structure around the channels where members can't modify that very easily? And then finally, how do you manage that risk of sprawl? How do you manage that problem of users getting turned off by Teams and starting to look elsewhere because they just can't manage that sheer volume sitting within the Teams interface? How do you ensure that those are archived effectively? What are your archiving rules? How long is a team active for? Do those rules apply differently to different types of teams? Maybe your projects are short and sharp, that you only create them for, a month or two, whereas other types of teams are created longer. And by thinking about these 4 different points, you can then pull together and start to plan out, actually, what are the different types of teams which we want to create in our organization, and those different rules which will apply across them. So those privacy rules, who can create those teams, what content and structure is applied to those teams, and how they are archived effectively. So what we encourage everyone to do when we're talking to people about Teams is 3 things. Firstly, document your requirements. So actually, you can say, oh, I want Teams, and can Provision Point help you? Absolutely, but actually we want you to think about what you want it to do first. Understand what your requirements are to use Teams, how you want to let users create teams, what are those different types of teams which get created. Secondly, think about the governance plan now. Don't think about it 6 months after rolling out Teams, when everyone's got frustrated with Teams and there's no clear guidance in place and no clear rules around how teams are created or archived. And then thirdly, the call to action around Provision Point is then, once you've had a thought about the first 2 items, we can help you with a trial of the Provision Point app. So you can install the Provision Point app into your tenant. It's very easy to install, and we can help you configure an experience relevant to your requirements. So thinking about how can we measure and deliver those requirements which are really key to you, and we try and build that into a trial rather than just, here's the Provision Point app, off you go. We want to give you something immediately of value. Now, firstly, thank you for spending about half an hour listening to me talk this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are based in the world. And I'm just now open up to questions. I've seen a few questions come in as I go through things. And so I'll try and answer those, but feel free to ask any other questions as I'm answering those. Okay, so I've seen a question coming in around the workflow. So how we, what options there are for the workflow components, is that based on flow or other workflow technology? So the approval workflow is built within Provision Point. That's something which you can configure within the Provision Point app. But you can also link out to third-party workflow tools, so things like Flow and Logic apps, or third-party workflow tools as well. So we support different options depending on what your requirements are. Okay, I've got another question which is around pricing. So you can access some of the pricing information on our website. So if you just go to provisionpoint.com, you can look up the pricing information, and there's some standard pricing listed there, dependent on the size of your organization. I've got another question here about, can you restrict folders? I'm not quite sure what you're asking there. You can certainly define which folders are included within a channel when it gets created. So that might be what you're asking about. If you could clarify, I'll maybe pick up on that one later on. Another question's come in about, we've already got a load of teams in our tenant. Can we manage those within Provision Point? The answer to that one is yes, you can do. So you can, we do support the bulk loading of existing teams into Provision Point, which you can then manage your own leases which you've defined against them, for example. Okay, so the person's come back around folders. Can you turn them off? I believe you can do. So that's a setting against the associated SharePoint site, so which gets created with the team. So I believe you can do that one, but I'll maybe pick that one up with you separately. If you drop me an email on the contact details, which I'll show you on the next screen, we can pick that one up specifically. The other one you've asked for is about, another person's asked about the connecting to Dynamics 365 and integration with Dynamics. So there is an out-of-the-box integration between Dynamics and Teams in terms of being able to show Dynamics within Teams. Provision Point also can be used, has been used by a number of our customers to actually provision teams based on a action happening within Dynamics. So maybe a new customer being created, for example, and then it creates a team with relevant settings. And that's not just restricted to Dynamics, that can also be other types of applications, so help desk systems like ServiceNow, or a financial system, for example. Okay, well, it looks like we're just about out of questions. I'll be on for the next couple of minutes if you've got any other questions. You'll also see there's my contact details, as well as our information and general contact information. So if you want to contact me about any of your specific questions, or you're interested in setting up a trial, please do. We'll be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar shortly, hopefully later this afternoon. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending.